Today we're going to be learning Beitzah Daf Vav. Okay, we're going to start, actually going to start with a quick review of certain things from yesterday. There were a lot of questions after class, so I want to clarify a few things. The first thing is we were talking about Shechianu and why we say we have a new fruit or new clothing. And I want to just do a review about exactly why this is. So if you recall, we had this issue that in the time of the temple, sometimes they instituted, right, depending on when Yom Tov would depending on when the witnesses came to declare the new moon, what point of Rosh Hashanah, again, because Rosh Hashanah is the first of the month, it's the only holiday that comes out on the first of the month. That day, it's a whole question. Is it this day? Is it not, right? It's so hard for us to imagine. But in those days, they really didn't know if Rosh Hashanah was the first day or not. So partly the issue was a suffix issue. Is this or is it not? And if the Eidim came before, if the witnesses came before Mincha, then that day would be declared the holiday. And everyone who was far away didn't know, so they'd be keeping either this day or that day. And that's really just the same as a regular Yontif. However, in the event that witnesses came after Mincha, then the rabbis said, listen, we don't want to say, okay, it's clear. Once they messed up the Shiur that one time, they declared any witnesses come after Mincha, today we're not declaring Rosh Chodesh. So theoretically, as soon as Mincha comes, that day doesn't really have to be a holiday anymore because what's the point, right? It's not a holiday. We know it's tomorrow. As soon as Mincha time comes, they know the holiday is only going to be declared tomorrow. But the rabbis didn't want everyone stopping and then starting to do malacha and forget saying, oh, it's not Rosh Hashanah, because next year they'll say, I'm not keeping Rosh Hashanah all day and not doing work all day just in case. Maybe, it'll be annoying. So they instituted, there's going to be one long day of Kedusha, right? In the event that, as we're going to say, today is sanctified and tomorrow is sanctified, even if tomorrow ends up being the first day. In the end, that's not really why we do this. In the end, we do this, we have a calendar, we know exactly what the dates are. And in the end, really the first day is the first day. And really, right, you could say that there's kind of two ways of looking at it. It could be it's Mishum Safek, the whole 2 days. It could be it's because of this one long Kedusha. So because of that, we're going to be, what they said is we're going to be strict when it comes to an egg, because maybe it's viewed as one Kedusha and, the way it was then. However, when it comes to saying Shechianu, we might go the reverse and say, listen, maybe it's, even in those days, there was a possibility that it was all done Mishum Sfeika if the holiday was declared earlier. So it's a little bit unclear here. So therefore, the rabbis say Shechianu twice in case, right, as the way they used to do it, in case then it was Sfeika Diyoma, maybe one day, maybe the other day. However, since there is this possibility that back then there was the rabbis instituted as one long day, well, and then you wouldn't be obligated to say Shechianu. So then, well, you should have something else like a new fruit or new clothing or something else to rely on. But really the bottom line, halacha and the poskim for the most part say that really halachically you're supposed to say Shechianu, when you're lighting candles or in Kiddush, for sure. And it's not really such a doubt. However, because there are some other opinions and we want to kind of fulfill those other opinions, they say better off to have something else as a backup. Okay, so that's number one. Number two, something I wanted to say, but I wasn't sure, I hadn't looked it up yet. I managed to look it up for today. This issue, another very relevant issue. It's fun to learn such relevant things. Yom Kippur. Why do we blow the shofar on Yom Kippur, after Yom Kippur? Okay, at the end of Yom Kippur, we blow the shofar. Why? So there's a number of different reasons given, and one of them actually comes from our daf. So if you remember, what did we say? We said that whole thing when we were trying to prove that if you had a gzerah and you had to, and it had to be repealed, we learned it from this pasuk, Bimshocha yovel hema yalu bahal. When the shofar blast blows, then everyone will know that the Shekhinah has moved, right? And then it will be permitted for them to go up the mountain. So the shofar signals the presence of God leaving Har Sinai. So I don't know, probably you're making this in your mind already, but and also there's a verse, and the truth is when the Beit Yosef quotes, he doesn't quote it from this verse, he quotes it from a different verse that says, Allah Elohim b'tru'ah. God went up. I'm like almost 100% sure it's one of the psukim in Shofarot that we're going to say on Rosh Hashanah. We also say it before we blow the shofar. God went up with a tru'ah, that the Shekhinah, right? And that's the Bimshocha Yovel Hema Yalu Bahal. Because of that, you can then go up on the mountain. So he says that's why we say Hashem hu Elokim 7 times, because it's God is going up the 7. There's these 7 firmaments like on the way up to the heavens. So it's God going up 7. It's basically the idea here is that God's presence was with us all of Yom Kippur, this beautiful idea. And as it's going up, right, we say Hashem hu Elokim, we say Shema Yisrael, and then the Beit Yosef quotes us in the name of his teacher, Rabbeinu Yehuda. And then we blow the shofar, like on Har Sinai, when God's presence left, they blew the shofar. So it's a very beautiful idea to have in your mind at the end of Yom Kippur when we blow the shofar about this, that it's kind of signaling, it's kind of saying goodbye to God's presence that was with us all day. Okay, moving on now to our daf. So we're still continuing with Yom Tov Sheni of Galuyot and how it's different from Yom Tov Sheni of Rosh Hashanah. Is it or is it not? And the first topic we're going to deal with is a person dies. What do we do? Can we bury the body on Yantif? So Amarava, you have to remember in those days, right? If you left it, they didn't have refrigerators to keep the bodies cold. So it was a big deal to leave the body laying around, especially if you have a 2-day holiday. So Amarava, mate, b'yom tov rishon yitasku bo amimi. If it dies, on the first day of Yantif, if someone dies, on the first day of Yantif, you're allowed to ask Gentiles to bury the dead for you. Okay, Amira la'akum, usually we say is not permitted. We learned about this in Masechet Shabbat. You can't tell a Gentile to do something you want to do on Yantif, however, or on Shabbat for all purposes. But if it's for kavod hamet, this is what we call, right? It's very important not to let the body sit and disintegrate. So we allow you to tell a Gentile to do it for you. Meit b'yom tov sheni yitasku bo Yisrael. If it's a dead, it's unclear how to read this. Does it mean it died on Yom Tov Sheni or a mate on the second? If someone dies on the second day of Yom Tov, even Jews are allowed to bury that person. Okay, we don't really do this anymore, but I'm going to read to you a really interesting Tosfot that maybe will give us a clue as to why we don't do this anymore. Okay, I didn't research exactly all the reasons why we don't do this today, but this Tosfot is a really interesting historical Tosfot, and I want to read it with you. But we'll get there soon. We have to read the whole sugya first. At the end of the sugya, we're going to read it. Then they say, even on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. So Gita, thank you for telling me. I thought that maybe there was. There are still communities that do it on the second day. I think it's not so common, but there are. Thank you, Gita, for telling me that. I wasn't sure. Okay, so now, even on 2 days of Rosh Hashanah, you can do this. In other words, again, is there a difference or is there not a difference? So now they say, Masha ein came Beitzah. Rava says, when it comes to the egg, we're going to be strict and say 2 kedushot. But when it comes to a dead body that we want to deal with, right, it's all a matter of how much of a need is there. An egg, okay, so wait till tomorrow. But when it comes to 2 days when it comes to a dead body and we want to deal with the dead body, we don't want to leave it, then even Jews are allowed to do it, even on Rosh Hashanah. Nehardea amre af bebeitzah. Nehardea says, what are you talking about? Nowadays, we can even be lenient when it comes to an egg on the second day of Rosh Hashanah. And why is that? And again, this goes back to what I said before, but all the confusion about it. What's the concern about a Beitzah Shenolda? You're worried that maybe Elul was really 30 days, and really the second day is really Rosh Hashanah. We know that the second day is definitely not Rosh Hashanah. How do we know this? Because Ha'amal Rav Chinina bar Kahana Amal Rav. Okay, Rav Chinina bar Kahana said in the name of Rav, Miyimot Ezra va'elach. From the time, we're going way back to the time of Ezra, when the second temple was rebuilt. From the time of Ezra and on, Lo matzinu Elul mu'ubav. Elul is never a 30-day holiday. It's always 29 days. We're on, so nice, we're on the 29th of Elul today. Tomorrow is Aleph Tishrei. No matter what, the first day of Rosh Hashanah is always the first day of the year. It's never, right? It's never the second day. It's never that we're going to say, oh, well, if the witnesses, right, this is still in the time when witnesses came. Forget about now. We have a calendar. But even the time when witnesses came, it never happened that Elul was 30 days and that the second day of Rosh Hashanah became the first day, even though theoretically witnesses could have come later, but it never was. This was always the case. So therefore he says, Rosh Hashanah, in other words, I don't understand. He says, of course, Rosh Hashanah, the second day, you can be lenient, and Beitzah Shenolda is muteret because it's really the first day is the holiday. So now, Amar Zutra, Lo Amaran, first he says, when Rava says, okay, now it's a bit of a debate about which part of Rava, but let's go with Rashi, that he's talking about the line that Jews are allowed to deal with the burial on the second day. Lo amaran ela de ishtehe. It's only if the person had died before Yantif and we can't leave it. And what happened? There was not enough time, or for whatever reason, they couldn't bury before Yantif, and it was kind of left waiting. Then we're allowed to do this. But if it wasn't left from before, and theoretically nothing will happen if we leave it one more day, then you're not allowed to do this. Rav Ashi Amar, he says, I don't know what you're talking about. Even if the person died on Yantif, it's not a problem to bury them on Yantif. You're allowed to do that. My timer, what's the reason? Here's a very fascinating line. Yom Tov Sheni Legabe Met Kichol Shavua Rabbanan. The second day of Yantif, when it comes to a dead body, the rabbis permitted it entirely. They viewed it as if for this issue, it's a Yom Chol. It's a very strong language to basically call Yom Tov Sheni a Yom Chol. And one could see where this would cause problems, right? Once you tell people, oh, you could do this, right? Makes them think, oh, maybe I could do other things as well, right? You could see maybe part of the problem here as to why maybe many people did away with this custom or this halacha, I would say. So he says, how so? You can even cut a piece of clothing or hadassim, myrtle branches, to respect the dead. Now, when we say about cutting clothing, we don't mean the tachrichim, the clothes for the dead body. That, of course, but this is even something that's more like cutting myrtle branches to make it smell nicer, to have respect for the dead body. Any kind of piece of clothing that you're cutting for whatever purpose to respect the dead, like maybe to put something on top of the dead body. But these are extras, clearly extras, and yet you're allowed to do them because in terms of anything you can do to respect this dead body, this again shows the importance of kavod hamet, okay, and how much we're allowed to do on Yantif Sheni. Amar Ravina, here comes the last line of the sugya, which is really maybe the clincher. V'ha'idna di'ika chabare chayshina. Nowadays that we have chabarim, what are chabarim? Okay, so Rashi says it's an evil nation that was in the time of the Persians. Okay, there's some people, I think we've had this before, they were maybe Persian magicians. Whatever they were people who are our enemies. And we're very much concerned. Okay, what's the issue here? We're concerned that they're going to say, if you can bury your dead, then you claim you can't work. Okay, this is the famous Shahi Pahi. Okay, this comes up in Masechet Avodah Zarah, which is that the Gentiles complain that the Jews say Shahi Pahi. What's Shahi Pahi? It's an acronym for Shabbat Hayom Pesach Hayom. The Jews are always saying, and this is great to learn in this time period, right? It's Shabbat today. It's Pesach today. Sorry, can't help you. Can't do my job. Can't this, right? This is right how Haman said this about the people. And I always think about when my first year in university, I went to school, we said, okay, it's Rosh Hashanah, we're not coming. It's Yom Kippur, we're not coming. Next week it's Sukkot, we're not coming. And then we say Simchat Torah, and they look at us like we're crazy. That's not in the calendar, right? Because there are calendars that have Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, but no calendar says Simchat Torah, and they thought we were lying, and it's exactly this, that there's this concern that they're going to say, and make fun of us and make us look bad, which we know happens over time, anti-Semitism and everything, that they're going to say, if you can bury your dead, then obviously you can come to work. And why are you not showing up to work? So this leads us to the Tosfot. So Tosfot in Dibur Matchil V'ha'idna Di'ika Chabare, he says, right, Rashi explains, Shekofin Yisrael La'asot Malacha, right? They force us, they do forced labor to us, right? But they leave us when it's Yom Tov. This is a quote from Rashi. And if they saw we would do this, they would do it. Comes to us when he says, okay, so how does this relate to us nowadays? Again, nowadays is Tosfot, France, 1200s. Right, nowadays we don't have these people anymore. The chabarim that Ravina talked about don't exist, right? We don't live under Persian rule and we don't have those same people. So it should be allowed. And don't say, oh, well, we instituted this takana, so we have to repeal it like we did yesterday. No, because this is only because of a danger. This isn't a halachic thing. There's a danger out there. The danger is removed. We don't have to deal with it. He brings the example. I'm not going to read this all inside. He says, just like the water and the snake in the water, which we've talked about a number of times, just like the snake in the water, we don't have to worry about anymore because we don't have snakes anymore that put their venom into our water at night, right? I don't know if you ever saw a snake walk through your house and put venom in. And therefore, Tosfot says you can also drink water that was left out overnight. So therefore, also here, the issue is not relevant anymore. If there's no danger, we're back to normal. We can do this. However, he says, "Umi kol makom," I'm like, 10 lines down. Rabbeinu tam haya oseh. Rabbeinu tam would forbid. And then he goes through to say that Rabbeinu Tam got upset with people because he said that there's people who aren't B'nai Torah. And what's going to happen? They're going to see, forget about the Gentiles complaining and anti-Semitic statements. It's our own people we're worried about. They're going to see that we can bury people. They're going to think, oh, clearly Yom Tov Sheni is not very serious. Now, anyone living outside of Israel knows that there's a lot of people who say, why are we doing this still, right? This is, we learn, minhag avotenu biyadenu. On account of that, we do this, right? So we have all these conflicting things. We want to respect the dead, right? On the other hand, we want to make sure people respect Yom Tov. And if we start allowing things to people who aren't B'nai Torah, we're going to get into trouble because then they're going to say, oh, I don't have to keep second day of Yantif at all. So he talks about that. And then he compares it to this issue of Bishul Akum and about cooking and this heter that they didn't want to allow B'nai Torah, but in the end, he says, but nowadays we do. So why do we permit that and not permit this? That was also an issue of what people who aren't halachic will see. Right there, it's that you can have a Gentile serve you food that could be even raw, that they cooked. But, if they're not B'nai Torah, they're going to think, oh, if a Gentile cooks, give me broccoli, because I could eat it raw, but I could also eat it cooked, then they could cook for me other things. But that is no longer, they don't really hold by that. It's okay. And so he says, I'm now 6 lines from the bottom. Omer dilo dami. Those are different. Why are they different? Because bishul akum is something you do privately. This, when we go bury someone, it's very public. Everybody sees. When it comes to something everybody sees, if we start permitting, right, it's going to cause right, there's going to be reverberations in all sorts of communities. And therefore, he said, we don't do this. That's why Rabbeinu Tam ruled, we don't do this. And then he adds at the end, Odamar Rabbeinu Tam. Now it's true we don't have chabarim, he says, but we do still have Jews. And again, this is why this is very interesting historically. He says, we still have Jews. I'm not going to read the whole thing inside. You could look on your own, who work for the authorities of, whatever government it is. And they're going to have the same sorts of problems as these chabarim. And therefore, he says, also, for that reason, we shouldn't do it anymore because then they're going to force them to do work on Yantif if they see that they do this. So it's very interesting to see, how this plays out in reality, right? Sometimes we see things kind of in a bubble, but in reality, there were issues on the ground by doing things. So something might be halachically okay, but then you have to be concerned for other factors. And it's interesting to see how, different factors in different time periods. In the Persians, it was the Chabarim. In Rabbeinu Tam's time, it was the Gentiles around. You have to remember, he had a very good relationship with Gentiles. Things were very good in where he was living. And there's a lot of, he in general, Rabbeinu Tam is famous for having a lot of heterim specifically, because people did business all the time with Gentiles. But still, there were still ones that, maybe the governmental ones, because that's what he seems to be talking about, was more of a problem. Whereas the average person was, had good relations, but there was this concern about, anti-Semitism flaring up, etc. It's a very interesting topic. Again, I don't know today why they've ruled. I didn't look up historically, how it went through. I'm sure no one knows exactly, but when it stopped and whether there were, what time periods, and as Gita said, there are some people who still do. But anyway, it's an interesting topic. Okay. Ravina, we're back to the Gemara, almost center of the page. Vav Amud Aleph. Ravina have a yativ kamei Rav Ashi. B'shnei yamim tovim shel Rosh Hashanah. He was in front of Rav Ashi on 2 days of Rosh Hashanah. Chazir dehava atziv. He saw that he was sad. Amar le, amai atziv mari. He said, what are you so unhappy about? Amar le, Rav Ashi said, delo tive eruvei tavshilin. I forgot to make an eruv tavshilin. Must have been Thursday, Friday, Rosh Hashanah, and Shabbat was on, Shabbat right after. And in order to permit cooking for Shabbat, you had to have done an eruv tavshilin. Amar le, velo tivmar ha'idna. He says, why don't you do it right now? Milo amar Rava, didn't Rava say, miniach adam eruv tavshilin miyom tov l'chavero matneh? You can make an eruv on, do one on Thursday and do one, either say, if today is Yantif, then I'm really doing it tomorrow. If tomorrow is Yantif, then it's today. And then basically, since only one of them is Kodesh, it should work. So Amarle, Imr to Amarava, right? You can see where this is going because it was Rosh Hashanah. So when Rava said that, Bishnei Yamim Tovim Shel Galiyot, he said it when we're talking about Sveka Diyama, right? 2 Kedushot. Then you can do that, like the egg. But he didn't say you could do this on Rosh Hashanah, where it's possibly viewed as one long sanctity. And then it's one day. You can't say, oh, if this day is Chag or if that day is Chag, it doesn't work. So then he asked, but wait, doesn't it say that even an egg is permitted? Amarle, Rav Mordechai, Beferish Amar Limar, Dilo Savar Laha did hardes. No, but Rav Mordechai said to me that Beferish Amar Limar, that he was taught by his rabbi that we don't hold by Nahardeh. We don't permit the egg, and therefore we wouldn't permit the Erev Tavshilin either, and that's why I won't do the Erev Tavshilin. Next topic. Okay, we're basically done with our 2 Yamim Tovim of specifically Rosh Hashanah, that whole sugya. We're finished with that. We're now moving to an Efroach Shenolad. We're kind of back to the Mishnah. We were talking about a Beitzah Shenolad, an egg. Now, what if a chick comes out? Are you allowed to slaughter the chick on Yom Tov? Is it a muktzah issue because it wasn't ready from before Yom Tov or not? So let's see. Itmar, Efroach Shenolad b'Yom Tov. I see just 1 minute. I just want to clarify because I see a question. I haven't followed all the questions in the chat, but I happen to notice this. So if it's Yom Arichta, one long day, you can, okay, so let me clarify what you need the Erev Tavshilin for. If it's one long day, then theoretically you could cook from one day to another. The problem is, first of all, you still can't do that because even an Erev Tavshilin doesn't help you with that. An Erev Tavshilin is only for Shabbat. It allows you to cook on Yom Tov for Shabbat. It doesn't allow you to cook from one day of Yom Tov to the other. Again, Rosh Hashanah, if you're cooking from one day to the other, if it's Yom Arichta, you could. But since the whole thing is we don't really know which one it is, it could be 2 sanctities, it could be 1. So therefore, we have to be stringent and we don't cook from one day to the other, right? So for example, on your second night meal, you can't cook in the afternoon of day number 1 for day number 2 exactly for this reason, because they're 2 separate days. And even if possibly they're one day, we don't really know that, so it's still not permitted. Okay, that's where we go in all directions. That's why the Shachianu also. We're keeping open all our options, so to speak. So now we say, what if an Efroach was born on Yom Tov? Rav amar asul, u'Shmuel v'yitem Rabbi Yochanan amar mutar. So Rav says it's forbidden, and Shmuel or Rabbi Yochanan says it's mutar. We're not sure who. So Rav amar asul muktzah, u'Shmuel v'yitem Rabbi Yochanan amar mutar ho'il u'matir atzmo b'shchita. So let's go through the reasons. Before, I just want to clarify something someone wrote me in the chat, which is true. I should be more clear about it, which is, any kind of preparation is not allowed on the first day for the second day, right? I always do something, we do like wraps, something very simple, that meal that you don't need to warm anything up you can't warm up, you can't set the table, any kind of preparation, you really can't do till the second day kicks in. That all comes from this issue that they're considered potentially 2 separate days, and therefore any kind of preparations are problematic. Okay, so now let's go back to our sugya. Rav says it's forbidden. Why? It's muktzah, right? The Efroach was inside, now it's outside. Now you have to remember another thing about an Efroach, and this is something we're going to see inside today, which is, I think we already mentioned it. In Efroach, okay, in its formation, it's considered a sheretz until it comes out of its egg, okay? And then we're going to see there's a debate exactly at what stage it stops being a sheretz. Sheretz is forbidden to eat. Once it's out, right, and we'll see what stage exactly, then it becomes permitted to slaughter and you can eat it. So Rav's opinion makes perfect sense. It's muktzah. It wasn't prepared before. It was forbidden to eat because it wasn't fully formed. It's inside the body of its mother, problematic. Therefore, it's muktzah. And you would really probably call it nolad. It was born, right? It wasn't existing before. Shmuel, v'item Rabbi Yochanan, whichever one said it, amar mutal, ho'il umatir atzmo b'shchita. This is a little bit of a tricky line to understand. I'll explain it in one of the ways it's explained, but I'll already put it out there. This is a little complicated. It permits itself when it's slaughtered. What does that mean? I just said that it permits itself for slaughter. Okay, when a chick is inside, so it's a sheretz. When it comes out and it's hatched and it becomes a chick, it's permitted to slaughter it all of a sudden, right? It becomes kosher, so to speak. It's potentially kosher. Since when it's born and it comes out, that event turns it into something that could be potentially now slaughtered. So it basically removes the status of sheretz that was called a creeping animal that was forbidden to eat. It removes that when it's born. So now here comes the jump. Therefore, it also removes the title muktzah. It's not considered muktzah anymore. In other words, let's put it this way. If it can remove a Torah prohibition of eating creeping animals, then of course it can remove the Rabbanit of muktzah. Okay, so basically, since it changes status anyway, right, which is funny because you would think all the more so nolad, but now since it changes its status, it removes the muktzah title. That's why it's a little difficult. It doesn't make the most sense to say this, but that's what their claim is. Okay, so at least we can understand what they're saying, even if it's not a clear-cut connection. But the fact that, again, this is one interpretation, because it's so unclear, so there's different interpretations how exactly to understand it. But basically, since the birth releases the prohibition of the creeping animal, the sheretz, therefore it also releases the prohibition of muktzah. So those are the two approaches. We're now going to deal with them. So first we have a question on Rav. And Rav is going to be stumped by this question. Amrle Rav Kahana v'Rav Asi the Rav. V'chima ben ze le'egel shenola b'yom tov. What's the difference between a chick that Rav, you're going to say is forbidden, it was born on Yom Tov, and an egel, a calf that was born on Yom Tov? Everybody agrees that you can eat. It's not a problem. You can slaughter it on Yom Tov. So they say, Rav, what's the difference? To which Rav has an answer. He's not yet stumped. He says, Amar lehen, ho'il muchan agav imo b'shlita. What does this mean? This means it's prepared. It's already usable because of its mother and slaughter. What does that mean? Okay, anyone who here will learn chulim will remember maybe this halacha of a ben pikuah. It actually comes up in a bunch of the sugyot later in Shas, in a bunch of the Masechtot. A ben pikuah is that if there's a special unique halacha, normally you can't eat an animal unless it's slaughtered, but there's an exception to that rule. If I slaughter an animal and inside there's a baby animal that hadn't yet left the body of the mother, I can eat that animal as is. If the animal's dead, great. If I can choke the animal, I don't need to do a kosher shchita on it. It's called a ben pikuah. It was matired, permitted from the slaughter of the mother. The slaughter of the mother covered is basically seen as, this is like what we talked about before, right? It's just part of the mother. So if the mother's slaughtered and is kosher, then the animal that's inside also. So therefore comes Rav and he says, well, since this animal was existing before and the animal could have been slaughtered, if the animal was slaughtered, I could have eaten what was in the egel that was inside the calf. Therefore, we're going to permit this calf to be eaten if it was born. Okay, you can now slaughter it. Obviously, you'd have to slaughter it. You can slaughter it and eat it. So that's so far so good. So he explained what the difference is. But now comes the big stumper question. If you have an animal that was a treifa, it couldn't be eaten. You can't slaughter it on Yom Tov. It's forbidden to eat an animal that's a treifa, right? That means an animal that's going to die within 12 months, has some sort of problem. So the animal wasn't prepared before Yom Tov. You couldn't eat the calf because of its mother, but when the calf is born on Yom Tov, you're actually allowed to eat it. And you can't, right? It should be muktzah in a case like that, according to your theory, Rav. So shatik Rav, he didn't know what to say. He was silent. He had no good answer. But comes Rav Yosef, or maybe Rabba, Amar Rabba v'item Rav Yosef. My time is shatik Rav. Why was he so silent? He could have answered the following. Leimale ho'il muchan agav imo leklavim. It's not like it was totally muktzah of the mother. The mother was in a status that if the mother had died, what would you be allowed to do? Feed it to the dogs, right? So therefore, the mother was already, I had it in my mind that I might use it to feed my dogs, and therefore I could use it to feed myself. So Rava should have, therefore I can have the calf and therefore do it. So now we're going to say, Amar le'Abai. So basically they're saying, why didn't Rav answer that? Would have been a good answer. Amar le'Abai, he couldn't have answered that. Why couldn't he have answered that? Okay, I'm going to read you the whole sentence without the Mishnah quoted in the middle, okay, because I want you to see where they're going. They're going to say, since something that's prepared for a human, like before Shabbos, I intended to use it for myself, or before Yom Tov, is not, I can't feed my dogs it to my dogs because it was meant for me, not for dogs. Therefore, something meant for dogs can't be eaten by me. Okay, that's going to be the second part of the sentence. So it's true. This animal was prepared. I had it in my mind that maybe I'd feed it to my dogs, but I didn't have in mind for me, and one doesn't go with the other. That's why Rav didn't answer this question. Okay, so let's understand this idea. Then we're going to reject it, and then we're going to be left with, again, why didn't Rav answer anything? Okay, Rav could have had an answer. So we're going to reject this, and as Rav and Rav Yosef said, why didn't Rav answer? It was ready for your dogs. And Abai is going to say, because that won't help you. And in the end, we're going to say, no, it actually could have helped you. And we don't know why really, we're going to be left with, we don't really know why Rav was silent and didn't answer this. So now, what is this Muchan la'adam lo havi muchan leklavim? This is Titna. According to Tanakama, you can cut gourds. We saw this just before. You can cut gourds and put them in front of your animal, even though they're not something that you would have eaten because they're not cooked, but you can cut them before your animal because it's dog, it's animal food, or you can give a dead animal, even though you can't eat it, you can give it to your dog. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, and this is the important part because we hold by Rabbi, or at least we're going to assume that Rav held like Rabbi Yehuda when it comes to muktzah. Remember, big machloka, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Yehuda. Yehuda holds there's more things that are muktzah. He says, it had to have been dead from before Yantif, because if it wasn't dead before Yantif, what's the idea? If it wasn't dead before Yantif, I might have wanted to slaughter it for myself. So it was ready for me, and therefore I can't give it to my dog. That's what we said in the beginning. Muchan la'adam lo havi muchan leklavim. So he says, if it wasn't dead before Erev Shabbat, it would be forbidden lefisha ein hamin muchan, because it was muchan. I wanted to use it for myself. So therefore, I didn't have in mind I was going to give it to my dog. So therefore, you can't give it to your dog if it dies. So now, here's the if statement. If muchan la'adam lo havi muchan leklavim, if something that I designated for myself, I can't give to my dog before Yantiv, I assumed I would eat this animal. Therefore, when it dies and I can't eat it because it's not kosher, I can't give it to my animal to eat. Therefore, muchan leklavim, lo havi muchan leklavim. This is a question. Havi muchan la'adam. You want to say then, if I planned on my dog eating it, that animal that was a treifa that was pregnant, and then the calf comes out, we can't say it was ready because of its mother, because it wasn't, because the mother was only for dogs, not for me. Okay, that's Abai's logic, to which he says, this is why Rav didn't answer this answer. But comes Ravina and he says, what are you talking about? Amrle, either Ravina or Rav Yosef, whoever it was, is it Ravina Rabba or Rav Yosef says to him, what are you talking about? That's not, your if statement doesn't work because you missed the whole logic behind it. Muchan la'adam lo havi muchan leklavim. Why? What's the logic of this halach of Rabbi Yehuda? That if it was ready for me to eat, and I was before Yantif, I had an animal, I thought to slaughter it on Yantif. It happens, it died on its own. I can't just give it to my dog because I was planning to use it for myself, which means, again, muktzah is all in my head. What did I intend? I intended for myself and not for my dog. If I had a choice and I had a good piece of meat, would I give it to me or give it to my dog? I keep it for myself. So what's the reason? If a person has something good for himself, he's going to keep it for himself and not give it to his dog. But muchan leklavim, havi muchan la'adam. But if this animal before Yantif was a treifa, and I knew I couldn't eat it, and I had in mind I'm going to give it to my dog, but there's some part of that could be for me, like I knew I was pregnant, and maybe it would give birth. Of course I was going to, and let's put it in these words. I'm always the center of my own existence. I'm going to be concerned about myself before I'm going to be concerned about my dog. And therefore, we're always going to side on, it's more, my mind is always on myself. And therefore, muchan leklavim havi muchan la'adam. Why? Before Shabbat, I'm going to think about any possible thing that I could use for myself. I'm going to already have had in mind that I'm going to use it for myself. Therefore, even though I couldn't eat this animal, maybe I had in mind that possibly the calf would be born and I'd be able to eat it. So obviously, I had that in mind. In which case, we're back to question one about Rav. This should be, right? Well then, right, according to this, right, why was Rav silent? Because Rav totally could have answered this. And then we don't really have an answer why Rav didn't say this. It's interesting. Their theory is that Rav was so brilliant. He obviously would have come up with any possible answer, right? Maybe he just didn't think of this. But to them, how could he not have thought of this? If we thought of it, obviously Rav must have been able to think about it as well. Tanya, so we end up having an answer for Rav, but the answer we don't have is why was Rav silent? We don't really know why he didn't suggest this. Okay, now we're going to have a Beitzah to support Rav and a Beitzah to support Shmuel. Tanya kavatei de Rav, Tanya kavatei de Shmuel. V'item Rabbi Yochanan, or possibly Rabbi Yochanan, because again, it's not clear who said it was permitted. So again, we're talking about this Efrach that was born on Yom Tov. Is it forbidden according to Rav, or is it permitted according to Shmuel or Rabbi Yochanan? We got sidetracked because they asked Rav, why is this any different than a calf that's born, which everyone agrees is allowed? Why is the chick different? And he had his answer there. So now, right, because the chick wasn't, remember, the chick is not edible when it's still inside, right? It's a sheretz. So now we're going to see this inside again in a Beitzah. Egel shenola b'yom tov mutal. That sounds just like, right? Everyone agrees about that. But efrach shenola b'yom tov asur. That's Rav. That an egel will be permitted, but the calf will be permitted, but the chick will not be. And the Beitzah continues and says, "Uma hefresh ben zeh lezeh." What's the difference between the two? And here, this is exactly the answer Rav gave. Zo muchana gavimo b'shchita, ve'zo eno muchana gavimo. Right? The chick will not be allowed if you slaughter the animal, because again, the chick at that early stage, before it actually is hatched, is considered a creeping animal, a sheretz, which is forbidden. So if you slaughter the mother, the tarnagolet, the hen, you can't eat the chick. But if you slaughter the other animal, you permit the egel, the calf. So therefore, that's the difference. That was a Beitzah that supports Shmuel. Now we're going to have a Beitzah to the Rav. Sorry. Now we're going to have a Beitzah that supports Shmuel. Tanya kavatei de Shmuel b'itema Rabbi Yochanan. Egel shenola b'yom tov mutal, ve'efrach shenola b'yom tov mutal. They're both permitted. My taima zeh muchana gavimo v'zeh matir atzmo b'shchita. Same two reasons we saw before, right? This one is permitted because of its mother, same as Rav, and the chick is permitted because again the shchita permits it for eating purposes. Therefore, it's also going to permit it for muksa purposes. Tanu Rabbanit. Now we have a Beitzah about this topic, about the sheretz aspect. We're going to have a machloket. Efrach shenola b'yom tov asur. If a chick is hatched on Yom Tov, it's forbidden. Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov omer af b'chol asur. Even on a regular day, it's going to be forbidden as soon as it's hatched. Why? Lefisha lo niftechu einav, because it didn't yet open its eyes. He's going to claim that only once it opens its eyes does it change from being a sheretz that's forbidden to a bird that can be slaughtered. So just coming out is not enough. It needs to open its eyes. So now they say, whereas Tanakama says, as long as it's born, that's enough. And it's only an issue for Yantif, but not on a regular day. So Kiman Az Lahadetanya, according to, is the following Beitzah. It's going to be quite obvious. You wonder why they asked this. Lechol hasheretz hashoretz ala aretz. What do we learn from Lechol, any creeping animal? Notice the extra. What does it come to include? L'rabot efrochim shelo niftechu eineihem. It's to add chicks that haven't yet opened their eyes. Again, this is like a way of seeing evolution, that it starts off as like a creeping animal and it turns into a bird. So until that stage that opens its eyes, it's not yet considered a bird. That obviously is Keman Rabbi Eliezer ben Yaakov's approach. Okay, now we're done with the chick. We're moving back to the egg. Amar Rav Huna Amar Rav. He's going to say a following halacha about an egg. And we're going to have 5 different ways to understand it. Only 2 of them we'll see today. You'll see the other 3 in tomorrow's daf. Beitzah im yitziata nigmara. He says these 4 words that are very unclear what they mean. An egg, when it comes out, it's completed. Okay. My im yitziata nigmara. What does this mean? Ilema, if you want to say im yitziata nigmara umuteret lo ochla b'chalav. Now, if you want to say, right, think about this. An egg comes from a chicken. A chicken is considered like meat. Okay, we'll get to the whole sugya in chulin. Chicken was a little different than meat, but for all intents and purposes, let's just say chicken's like meat. That means that inside the body of the animal, we're going to treat it, the egg, like it's meat because it's part of a bird. Whereas once it comes out, it becomes its own entity, and then you can permit it to drink with milk or to eat with milk. So they say, and if that's the case, right, and then you'd say, and what he's saying is, when it's still in the tarnagolet, inside the hen, you cannot eat it with meat. However, you can't say that because the Hatanya, it says in a Beitzah, it says it explicitly. If you slaughter the hen and inside you found eggs that were perfectly, fully developed, you'd be allowed to eat them with milk. So it's not that the the laying process, right? When it's laid, that's what causes it. Even inside the womb, it's still, or whatever, inside the hen, it's still permitted, okay, to eat with milk. So that's not the issue. So let's try the second one. When it comes out, in other words, it has to come out before Yom Tov. This is Hachana de Rabbah, has to come out before Yom Tov. Otherwise, it's not going to be permitted, right? If you find it inside the womb, it would be forbidden to eat on Yom Tov. Maybe that's what he means. Now, this would be against the Rabbah, the comment of Rabbah that said that an animal, that the egg is ready 24 hours before. He would say, no, the egg is only ready when it comes out. And only when it comes out does that make it, right, that it was muchan. It had to have come out from before Yantif. If it's still in before Yantif, then it would be a problem. So therefore, if you were to slaughter the mother and find eggs inside on Yom Tov, you wouldn't be allowed to eat them. But you can't say that because Hatanya, it says in a Beitzah, it says explicitly in a Beitzah that you're allowed to eat them. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe we don't hold like this Beitzah. This Beitzah is telling us something that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi in the Mishnah didn't think to put in. If he didn't put it in, maybe it means he doesn't hold that way. And maybe we can just ignore this Beitzah because the fact that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi ignored the Beitzah, maybe there's a fascinating thing in and of itself, right? We don't always say this. But the fact that he didn't mention it, maybe we don't hold this way. And maybe we could just chuck it out the window and say, this shouldn't bother us. But you can really infer it from our Mishnah directly because Hanami Tanina, it says in our Mishnah, and what did we say? We can infer from here. Right? Their whole machloket is about a Beitzah shenolda, but it seems to imply that what? The fact that the Mishnah doesn't mention it, maybe because divrei kol sharian, maybe it's just because everybody permits it. In other words, maybe the inference from our Mishnah could be that this is permitted, in which case it can't be what Rav is saying, because Rav is saying it's forbidden. So they say, well, maybe you'll say, maybe Beit Hillel also forbids it. If you slaughter the animal and find eggs inside, maybe you can't eat them. Sorry, I skipped the line. And the reason why it says laid is the whole question is why they picked Nolda and it didn't talk about shechting the tarnagolet and finding the eggs inside. So maybe it's just because we wanted to say the Beit Shammai is so lenient that even an egg that's laid, forget about an egg that was found inside the chick, but inside the hen. But we still can't say that because even if we say we don't paskin this way, we still would have to say it has to fit into one approach. And mane lo Beit Shammai but lo Beit Hillel. This line doesn't match anyone. Why does it not match anyone according to that explanation? Because according to our explanation, we're going to say that everybody, right, that Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel disagree about both cases. If they disagree about both cases, then Beit Shammai would never in a Beitzah say, if you shochet the tarnagolet, the Beit Simmer Mutarim, he would always bring the case of Nolda. So that can't be Beit Shammai, because if he would have authored it, he would have said, even when they're laid, they're permitted. And Beit Hillel thinks that they're not permitted according to this because they argue in both cases. So it can't be Beit Hillel either. So it matches no one, in which case our Beitzah has no real author. We're assuming it has to match one of the approaches, to which case we say it can't possibly be that Rav says us. So we're back to square one to figure out, right? We saw two options. Beitzah Yitziatan Gmera means either it's now permitted to eat with milk, but that's not true because it already was before. And it can't be Yitziata, it's permitted to eat on Yom Tov, because we are, according to Beit Shammai, right? Because we already saw that even in utero, Beit Shammai permits it, and everyone permits it then. So it can't be saying that. So we have to go back and figure out what actually does Rav say. As I said, 3 more options. You'll see them in tomorrow's daf. And with that, we'll finish for today. As I said before, all the dapim will be up within like the next hour or so. So anybody who wants to learn ahead before Rosh Hashanah can do that. There's also a sheet. So if you want to learn on your own, there's a sheet for tomorrow's daf, not for any of the others, but there's a study guide if you want to print it before Yantif. Have a Shana Tova, everyone. K'tiva v'chatima tova, and we'll meet up after the Chag.